Welcome back, everybody. I'm Sandy Rosenthal, host of Beat the Big Guys. And today, my guest is from the great state of Wisconsin, Campbell, Wisconsin. And her name is Lee Donahue. Hey, Lee.
Hi, Sandy. Nice to see you today.
It's wonderful to see you. How's the weather in Wisconsin today?
Very warm.
I was afraid you were going to say that. What did the temperature get up to today?
It's probably close to 90, but then again, you add in the heat index. We're probably close to 100 today. It's pretty warm.
Wow. You know, in New Orleans, it's only 88 today, and we feel so grateful. It's only 88. So I took the dogs walking when it was nice and cool, 88.
Oh,
So I know. Well, here's hoping we get through this spell soon, and here's hoping we get some better legislation to deal with it. So, but anyway, I'm so excited about my guest. Let me tell you just a little bit about her, and then we'll go ahead and start. Lee Donahue is originally from Miami, and she's a 15-year Army combat veteran who served in 20 countries. Thank you for your public service. Your military service, excuse me, way more than public service. Lee worked for local, state, and federal governments for 22 years, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Headquarters for the Upper Mississippi River Refuge. She now considers Campbell, Wisconsin, her home because that's where she raised her family. Now, her primary focus is PFAS water contamination. And don't worry, we're going to make sure you know exactly what PFAS is before this episode is over. And when Lee was originally told that the town of Campbell's PFAS contamination was only a pencil-thin plume, she got further private well testing that proved that the PFAS contamination is widespread. She continues to work with residents and government organizations, scientific entities, environmental groups to research and develop short and long-term safe water options to protect residents. Lee recognizes the power and the value of I'm starting all over again, Jess. Lee recognizes the power and the value of community collaboration. And that is why Lee is on the Beat the Big Guys podcast today. Lee, thank you again so much for joining us. And we all can't wait to hear more about what you've been doing in Campbell.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for the invitation and the opportunity to join you here today. You know, it's hard to believe it's been almost a 2-year journey. We were originally told in October of 2020, my town clerk got a phone call that said, just thought I'd want to let you know there's a possibility you may have some water contamination in a really small neighborhood due south of the airport. We're like, okay, just one small neighborhood? Like, how did this happen? And they went on to tell us, well, we used a specific type of firefighting foam at the airport. And now it's been determined that that foam may be toxic. And because of that, this small residence, this neighborhood may be affected. So they did some testing. And I'll tell you a little bit about PFAS. PFAS has been used since the 1950s in a variety of products, everything from Teflon pans to Gore-Tex raincoats. But what the makers knew way back in the 50s, but didn't disclose to the general public, is that these compounds were toxic, especially when they were ingested. And that's what's happened here. These residents in this small neighborhood with the pencil-thin plume had actually been drinking water that had been contaminated with PFAS. And it's possible that that had been occurring as far back as the 1950s, 60s, or 70s when that foam was used. And so the state of Wisconsin had been pushing very hard for standards that said, if you have 20 parts per trillion in your water, and that's equal to about 20 grains of rice in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, That is too much. That's unsafe for your health. It's unsafe for your children. It's unsafe for your pets. And quite frankly, it's unsafe to use that water to water your edible garden. We found people in this pencil thin plume. Many had hundreds of parts per trillion, and some of them had as many as 3,000 parts per trillion. So absolutely toxic water. And we couldn't really understand that the city of La Crosse, who owns the airport and who gave us this bad news, was convinced that only this small neighborhood was contaminated because the entire apron of the airport is surrounded by other residences and businesses. So we went to the Department of Natural Resources and we said, we want you to do more testing. We think there's an expanded scope and extent of contamination. And they told us, no, we believe that the city probably has it right. It's probably just this one small neighborhood. And we recognized that that was highly unlikely with the groundwater flow. We live on an island. We have a river to the east of us and a river to the west of us. We're only 4 square miles. How could it only be concentrated in these 4 square blocks? And so residents came together and they said, we're willing to bite the bullet. This is an expensive test. It costs upwards of $500. It takes upwards of several weeks to get the results. But we want to know for certain, is our water really safe to drink? And what we found is that it wasn't, that the contamination was not limited to this tiny neighborhood, that in fact, the contamination was widespread from the north and the south, east and west sides of the island. And based upon that information, the DNR came back and said, you know what, we do need to do more testing. So after they tested altogether 555 plus homes, what they discovered is that 97% of those had some level of PFAS contamination, which meant it was no longer safe to drink our water, use it for cooking, rinsing off your toothbrush, watering the tomatoes in your backyard, or feeding to your cat or dog. It was a nightmare, and it changed our lives in a heartbeat. After that happened, we went back to the DNR and they spoke with the Department of Health, and the Department of Health looked at all the test results and how widespread they were. There's really the one crazy thing about PFAS is that it isn't necessarily confined to one level of the groundwater or the groundwater table or the aquifer. So you can't simply say, if my private well has 60 parts per trillion, my next door neighbor will probably have 50 or 40 or 70 parts per trillion. It moves through the ground in a very unusual way, and a lot of it is reliant upon the rock structure that is in the aquifer. So depending upon that rock structure, you may have 5 parts per trillion and your next door neighbor may have 100, or they may have 20, and then you may have 600. So there's no way to really estimate how much contamination is there. And because of that, the Department of Health said, you know what, we're issuing a health advisory for the entire island, for all residents. So the 4,300 residents all now are entitled to get bottled water, which comes in a big, heavy 5-gallon jug that you have to bring inside because it has to be climate controlled. As in Wisconsin, everything freezes in the wintertime and you don't want it exploding in your garage and leaving a huge icy mess next to your car. So we have bottled water for right now until we are able to determine what a long-term safe water solution is going to be.
And lots of plastic.
Yes, and lots of plastic. The good thing about it, though, is that the plastic does get sterilized before the water bottles get used again. So at least the plastic is not all going into the trash. The company comes and picks up the empty bottles, takes them, sterilizes them, refills them, and then brings them back again. But that trash is a very important part, because if you look at what happens to filters, because some people have tried to use filters, maybe at their kitchen sink or maybe at their bathroom sink. It's awful hard to teach a little kid, you drink out of the water in your bathroom and you've brushed your teeth there your whole life. But now all of a sudden, that tap water is toxic. What do you do? How do you unteach a child to use the tap? And it's very difficult. So some people have tried installing some filters under maybe their kitchen sink or their bathroom sink, hoping that that might be able to remove a safe level of the PFAS. But what we're now discovering, there is no safe level. PFAS is like lead. There's no safe level of lead. And the EPA, just within the last few weeks, came out with health advisory recommendations, advisories for two of the oldest PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. And those new advisories are not 70 parts per trillion like they were in 2016. Now they are 0.004 parts per trillion or 0.02 parts per trillion, which basically means if it's detectable, it's unsafe.
If there's any, it's too much.
Yes, exactly.
Wow, I'm speechless. And I thought I did know a lot about this even before talking to you today. And now with each thing I learn, I'm just more shocked. What is the main company? I mean, I know there's DuPont, there's 3M, but what companies were you dealing with in your work trying to expose this problem in Wisconsin?
Well, in Wisconsin, the adjutant general and the governor just Wednesday announced a lawsuit against 18 different companies that they believe are responsible for the contamination that is widespread across Wisconsin. So I don't have the list in front of me right now, but I can certainly get it to you. There's a petition by the Midwest Environmental Advocates, along with the League of Women Voters, that have asked for groundwater standards for the state of Wisconsin. And the adjutant general and the governor are seeking to sue these 18 companies because we know that the toxicity of these products has been known for more than 50 years. At one point in time, they called it the Teflon flu. When they took women who were working on the production line, they recognized that many of those women were having children that were born with serious birth defects. And so they recognized even then, and they tried to put into place some techniques and mechanisms to safeguard their employees, but they didn't put any mechanism into place to safeguard the public that were living in homes near those manufacturing plants, where a lot of the fluids and the processes were feeding directly into rivers, the Mississippi River, many rivers, especially throughout the Midwest. And then, of course, the AFFF, the airport firefighting foam, has been used at many airports, military airports, as well as civilian airports. And the one thing that they've done in Europe and Australia is they outlawed the use of AFFF. And as a matter of fact, Australia outlawed it more than a decade ago because they recognized how toxic it is. And one of my fights has been trying to get the FAA to also outlaw AFFF. It does not need to have that carbon fluorine bond in its makeup. It doesn't need that to be effective. And the largest airports in the world, Heathrow International, Orly and Charles de Gaulle, and Berlin, all these huge international airports no longer use foam that has that carbon fluorine bond in it because they recognize the impact to the environment. And we need to be on board to do the exact same thing.
Yes, we do. The place where you were talking about where the employees were having babies with these terrible birth defects. And in the small, I read about this with a very small population, and even in this small group, there was the incredibly rare birth defects were happening, the identical birth defects. What are the odds? The evidence spoke for itself, but still the companies covered it up. And that, my understanding, it was DuPont. That was my understanding. In Virginia,
I believe it's in West Virginia.
West Virginia. And it was the subject of Robert Bellot's book called Exposure. And they made a major movie out of it. And so he did a lot of work. He pretty much devoted 20 years of his life to just that. And here we are, that we're still battling it. We're still battling it, which is crazy. Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Please do.
This is a okay time? So I love how you talked about how you took the contamination and you put it in terms of 3 grains of rice in an Olympic-sized pool. I said, that's very, very helpful if you're out there trying to explain something technical. And often when you're trying to beat the big guys, it's technical. And that's how the big guys hide. They hide behind the technical. But if you can do what Lee, if you all out there can do what Lee just did today, she said, 3 grains of rice in an Olympic-sized pool. That's a visual, and that will really help you when you explain, what it is you're trying to do, what your mission is, what your goal is. So that was really great. And I also couldn't help but notice you questioned, wait a minute, how can a small neighborhood have only this small neighborhood be contaminated? It doesn't make sense. And I'm guessing you're not a hydrologist by training?
That is correct. I'm not a hydrologist by training, but we're all on private wells. Mm-hmm. And so we all have a straw stuck into the same aquifer.
Mm-hmm. And my point is, you don't have to be a trained hydrologist to ask a reasonable question and make a valid point. In fact, it may even be better that you're not a hydrologist or a trained hydrologist, because then you don't have to worry about your career. Then the big guys can't come and ruin your career if you're a trained hydrologist. But if an ordinary citizen at large, you, me, any of us, we can all ask a question, a reasonable question, and make a valid point. And you did. You did. That's great. And look where you are now. Look at the successes you've had so far. There's something else that I wanted to ask you. Oh, the $500 that it cost, which is a lot of money. It's a lot of money to anybody, $500. So how were you able to raise the money to do that testing that you wanted done?
So what happened is, because we're all on individual private wells, what some residents did is they kind of went in halfsies on it. It's like, okay, we'll test your well. You're right next to me. So chances are, if your well is contaminated, my well is contaminated too. We're both drinking out of the same aquifer, and our wells may be, 20 feet apart. So it's a reasonable assumption if yours is contaminated, mine is too. So a lot of residents split the cost, maybe with their next door neighbor. We have a lot of families that live on the island. Originally, we were a farming community. And so there are generations here that go back when there were a lot of farms. Now, most of the farms are broken up into residences and neighborhoods. But some family members said, well, grandma lives across the street and Sister Sue lives 2 doors down. Let's just all pitch in and we'll test one of our wells. And then that's going to be most likely evident of whether there's additional contamination. And some of the rest of the folks just pretty much bit the bullet and said, well, I'm going to put it on the credit card and I'll pay it off as I can.
There you go. So that's one great possibility. Just split it up. I mean, why should one person have to shoulder the entire burden? But then there's always, whenever you do what Lee Donahue did, or what I did 17 years ago when I spoke up against the Army Corps of Engineers, when you open up your mouth and speak up, people will hear you. And there may be some people who may not be able to join you physically, but they can help you financially. They may say, I'm disabled and can't get out, or I can't, or maybe because they don't want to lose their job, or all kinds of things. But for whatever reason, they can't physically join you, but they may be able to offer you money. And it will come if you just be an upstander and speak up. And it starts with just one person. So that's how you, uh-huh.
I'm sorry, Sandy, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I was just wrapping up to say, the money will come. There's two different ways we just explained. One is people will donate it, and the other is you split it up, and that makes it manageable for people, affordable.
One of the other things I think that's really been important for me is collaboration, reaching out to people that are in somewhat the same situation. And sadly enough, there are many communities across the state of La Crosse that are currently facing PFAS contamination in their water as well, or other forms of contamination, like Laura Ola, of course, who lives down near the former Badger ammunition plant. And, we share stories and we talk to each other and we strategize together. And we reach out to our elected officials together. And having that collaboration is also very powerful. You are probably not in your situation all by yourself. There's someone else that may be in the next county or the next state or somewhere else in the US or in the nation or internationally that has a similar situation. And that is so helpful and powerful when you can collaborate with others.
Absolutely. That is extremely good advice. I hope all of you are paying attention to that. It is, as much as we would like to wish, you can get huge things done with just a handful of people. It's usually very difficult. You usually need coalitions, alliances with other similar groups, and get those people on board. And it's not as hard as it sounds. It's really not, because we all care about health. I mean, who doesn't care about health? Okay. So lost my train of thought where I was going, but so moving forward, it's critical, to speak up. And I just want to say, Lee, that you have already had a major success, but I'm sure you're not focused on that. I'm sure you're focused on what's next. We leaders don't have time to sit and congratulate ourselves on the successes we've had. There's always the next job, the next battle, the next mission. And how would you describe what's next for you at this point with PFAS?
Sure. Well, one of our recent successes has been the collect pilot program to collect some folks may under or in their bathroom. My connection says it's unstable, so I'm going to stop for a second and double check.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
And maybe we should pick up where I said what's next, because I think that's where we had a freeze.
Yeah, let me just double check that
Sure.
I'm not dropped on my internet. Nope, it seems like it's okay now. So
Okay.
I think we're good to go again.
So let's pick up where I just asked you the question, what next?
So what's next for us? We recently started a pilot program in the state of Wisconsin between La Crosse County and the town of Campbell to take discarded PFAS filters. So some folks have tried to install mini filtration systems under their sink. At first, especially before we were given bottled water, people were trying to figure out, how can I do just something to lessen the amount of PFAS that is in my water? And a lot of people installed these little point of use systems under their kitchen or under their bathroom sink. And what happens then when you go to dispose of the filter and change the filter out? In the state of Wisconsin, there was no mechanism to safely dispose of those. And where I live, our trash goes to a waste to energy incinerator, and it's roughly a mile away from my house. So here we are in the town of Campbell. We know we have contaminated water. We don't want these contaminated filters making it down to the incinerator, where we know that the temperatures are not hot enough. They were not designed for PFAS. we want to make certain that there is a safe alternative disposal method. So we have recently started a program to collect the filters, store them in dry storage until the technology catches up that can break that very strong carbon fluorine bond, where they can be safely disposed of without us rearranging PFAS. And that's what we talk about a lot. We don't want to rearrange it from my community to your community, from the groundwater, from a filter to the air, back down to the soil again. We can't rearrange PFAS. We have to turn off the flow. And that's really what we're working on next, is how do we turn off the flow? And let me tell you, it's a big challenge because the manufacturers don't want to stop using these compounds.
Mm-hmm.
It's money. They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to stop, and they don't want to have any caveats or any safety protocols. They want to just keep doing business as usual.
Mm-hmm.
But if they keep doing business as usual, more and more and more communities are going to end up like ours, living with toxic tap water.
It's my understanding, doesn't like 97% of the American people have some of these PFAS in our blood?
We do, and there are a variety of reasons. There are many fast food organizations that like to have these food wrappers that have some element of PFAS in them because the oils and the ingredients from maybe their burger or taco or whatever their product is won't soak through it. So at what point in time, I would rather have a wrapper that the oil, the grease, the whatever, the taco sauce, bleeds through, to know that I'm not possibly ingesting some particles from this food wrapper that are going to end up in my body, because, once it's in there, it's not going
Forever.
anywhere.
The body
For
doesn't know
decades.
what to do with it. The body has
It
no idea.
just-
The cells don't know how to react to it.
It just accumulates in
Right.
your tissue,
Right.
in your kidneys,
Mm-hmm.
in your liver. And
Mhm.
it takes decades and decades and decades for it to leave your system.
I didn't know it could ever leave.
It
Guess I'm gonna have to
can
live to
over
200.
time. But again, right? Why would you want it there in the first place?
Right. Well, this has been incredibly enlightening. I thought I knew everything, and turned up I didn't. Thank you. I was kidding, of course, but thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting, incredibly insightful. I've learned a lot, and I hope our guests too. Thank you so much, Lee, for joining me today.
Thank you.
And thank you, all of you, for joining me. I hope that all of you enjoyed this episode. Please be sure to like, rate, and review this podcast. It only takes a couple of seconds. Just give it 1 5-star rating on wherever you listen to your podcast. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys. Okay, stay with me, Lee.